Thank you all for being here. And I'm very, very excited to have this conversation with Albert, and even more excited that it's not his first trip to India, so not your first rodeo.
I think it's my 25th visit to India.
And you've been to Rajasthan before, you said.
I came to Jaipur when I was a student, so 30 years ago. It's a great thrill to be back here.
Yeah, and a round of applause for that. So we're going to talk about your book, The Imagination Muscle, which has a fascinating subtitle, Where Good Ideas Come From and How to Have More of Them. So of course, there's the secret sauce. You're going to give us that little recipe. But let's start by asking you, what do you mean by this flex of imagination as a muscle? What led you to realize this? What led you to write the book?
I was led to write the book originally by an idea that's been in my mind for several years now. And I started following my own advice of reading what no one else is reading. And when I was in my 20s, I read a book called The Secret Language of Cinema by Jean-Claude Carrière, who is a French scriptwriter, very well known in France, not so well known outside of France. He wrote... The what? Of course he did, yes. And he wrote many films with Luis Buñuel. And he and Luis Buñuel, when they were filming, as he wrote in his memoir, at the end of each day of filming, they go back to the hotel and they would set themselves a task. They'd each go to their room for 30 minutes, and they each had to come up with an idea for a story. And then they'd reconvene in the bar half an hour later. And the reason they did this, as Carrière says, is because they wanted to keep their minds fresh and develop, keep their imagination muscles strong. So Carrière came up with this idea of the imagination muscle, this idea of something you can train, the imagination being something you can work at. And so that was the initial genesis of this idea. And then in my business career, I've worked for many, many years at Condé Nast, which is a big publishing house with titles like Vogue and GQ and Wired and Architectural Digest and Traveller. And really, as the managing director of the British business, one of the things that I was very concerned with, and one of the things that I thought was very important, was that we kept the pipeline of ideas coming through, and that when I had meetings with the editors, I said, so what are your ideas? They could be editorial ideas or commercial ideas, but the important thing was to have ideas and to have an expectation of ideas built into the DNA of the company. And in the way that we had to secure the supply of paper for our magazines, I wanted to secure the supply of ideas. And this really was something that has always interested me. And then the third level to this is really a wider societal issue of, are we having enough ideas? Is the world being creative enough? And are we systematic in applying the lessons of the past in how we create ideas, how we come up with new concepts? Are we disciplined about it? Are we systematic enough about it?
And in the book, Albert goes through sort of generations of great thinkers, writers, what they did. There are tips, including this one of like read things that other people aren't reading, which is some advice someone gave you when you were younger.
Yeah.
And I was struck by several passages. I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit more about this, where you say, have the courage to be a beginner. You write this, and you say that it takes courage to have imagination. So do you want to talk to us a little bit about that and then do the reading? Yeah, that'll be good. Read the introduction, then we can do the bit on the courage, yeah.
I might just read you a few paragraphs from the introduction of the book, just to give you a flavor of what the book is trying to do. So I'll start in the middle of the introduction. At an individual level, we might be alert to a new and insidious pressure to imagine less. Aspects of the digital space that we now occupy can erode our will by design. Our spare moments, once given over to imagining, now possess the niggling fear of wasting time, not keeping up, of missing out. And a modern imperative is emerging to remain in agreement with ourselves, never to imagine that we might be wrong. The age of technology makes it easier than ever to swipe away from the uncomfortable and the disagreeable, from ideas which, on reflection, might have positively altered our mind's course. To imagine something different takes more courage than it used to, when every observation and thought is transmitted and parsed in real time by an anonymous and unforgiving digital audience. Why would you risk a bold new idea? There is for some a worrying sense of the future closing in on us, closing in on the human spirit, a loss of human agency, and our roles within this future feeling more uncertain. Constant bursts of shallow information from devices that never leave our grasp can make it worse, creating an anxious and enervating existence in a fragile physical environment. This is a period of anxiety, as it was for the early 19th century Romantic poets. They surveyed the burning smokestacks of northern England and worried about a severance with the natural world and our continued ability to breathe physically and imaginatively. There are many of the same concerns today. And so it might be, again, a time to reassess and reaffirm the worth of Homo sapiens to the world, to reflect more deeply on our purpose, and conclude that even when everything else feels like it is falling away or has been surrendered to technology, there is a treasure, the imagination, that remains emphatically ours. The imagination is what we've got. We need to understand it, and we need to cherish it, and we need to use it. If we can foster its greater presence in our lives, then we should do so with more focus, greater energy, and even with some urgency.
I think that's beautiful because we're here at a literature festival and you're basically like, go forth and imagine. You have
Yes.
we have your blessing. Why do you think it takes courage to imagine? And for you personally, writing a book like this, do you feel that it takes
I think we get out of the habit of imagining. I think certainly in certain types of societies, we've lost the knack of imagining for ourselves. We've become the passive recipients of other people's imaginations. We tend to tune into Netflix rather than writing our own stories. And you see in certain societies still people dance together, they have festivals together, they sing together in groups, but too many societies have lost that. And I think there comes a point when you as an individual find you haven't written a story or composed a piece of music or a poem or done anything creative of your own for years, if not decades, or even since you were a child. And I think it becomes an uncomfortable feeling, an uncomfortable notion to engage in imagining for yourself because you don't quite know what you're going to discover. You don't quite know whether it's going to be any good. But my point is, don't worry about it being any good. Just the act of doing it releases something inside you. And if you don't do it, you're losing something about yourself. And all the evidence, all the data suggests that acts of creativity on an individual level promote happiness, they promote stability, they promote ideas which can help you in all sorts of different ways.
And you know, you do say that it's actually youth and openness, so wonderful news for the young people in the audience. And you know, Jaipur, the Lit Fest gets a lot of young audiences, that it's youth and openness that's historically lent itself best to imaginative achievement. But this is something we should all seek to unlock, this beginner's mindset.
Yes, I write a lot about the beginner's mindset, this idea of being open to new ideas. And really, there's this philosopher, William James, the brother of Henry James, who wrote a lot on this subject. And his view was that the human mind is open to new ideas and thoughts until the age of 30. And then something happens. Your mind crystallizes. And the thoughts and beliefs and thought systems that you have at that point tend to stay with you for the rest of your life. Now, I think there's an element of truth to that if one isn't careful. And certainly, if you look at the great creative achievements in history, they tend to be done by people in their 20s and early 30s. But what I'm saying in this book is there are ways of overcoming that, of retaining a beginner's mindset, of keeping yourself fresh and keeping yourself stimulated so that you retain this freshness, this openness throughout your life. And there are certainly examples of that, of artists and writers who've done that well into their 80s and 90s. I'm always struck by something else that I discovered in the research that I did for this book. Amongst Nobel Prize-winning scientists, they show, in a piece of research that was done, they show a disproportionate tendency to be artists on the side. So if you look at Alexander Fleming, the discoverer of penicillin, who won the Nobel Prize in 1945, he was also a member of something called the Chelsea Arts Club in London, and he was also an artist, and not a very good artist. In fact, his art was derided by most people who saw it. But nonetheless, he took this idea of art and this beginner's mindset, and then took it over to the other side of his work. And one sees countless examples of that. There's Richard Feynman, the particle physicist, who won the Nobel Prize in 1955. He was also an artist. And then there are more familiar examples. Isaac Newton was a painter and a poet, and Einstein, we all know, played the violin. So there is this interesting relationship between the two sides of the brain fostering and feeding on each other. And really, it's this need to be, throughout your life, a beginner at something that helps you in the day job, as it were, whatever it is you spend most of your time doing.
No, I love that. And take the pressure off to be wonderful at everything, especially in this Instagram era where everyone wants to be, perfect at.
Exactly.
So there's another blanket permission we all get. So it is the age of AI. I have to ask you about your thoughts. You talk about imagination being integral to development, to life, to humanity. Do you think that's a big differentiator? How are you looking at AI in terms of this whole context?
I think AI is, I kind of have a pessimistic and an optimistic take on AI when it comes to the creative world. I think on the pessimistic side, AI is already taking a lot of the jobs at the lower end of the imaginative hierarchy. So if you talk about the creative jobs around, I don't know, music for advertising or copywriting for catalogs, these types of jobs that were previously the entry-level roles for people who wanted to go on do other things have now been taken away. So if you're a composer, really, it's quite hard to get work in TV these days, but it will become harder because your job can be done by AI for virtually no cost. So I think that is an issue. And it alters the whole structure of the economic structure of the creative industries, which I think we haven't yet felt the ramifications of. But on the optimistic side, I think AI will become and has become the best researcher you've ever had if you're a writer. It's become the best tool and the cheapest tool you could ever imagine if you're in the video games industry or if you're in the special effects industry. These are areas which previously required millions of pounds and tens or hundreds of people to do things which can now be done very, very efficiently and quickly. So that democratizes whole new swathes of creativity and allows new people to come in and upends the economic model of the artistic industries. So I think it's a very interesting era we're entering, not an easy one.
And in terms of
but an interesting one.
The sort of USP of humanity, is imagination our flex, like creativity and humanity?
I think it is, yes. I think AI is like a rising tide, and I think it's taking a lot of what we consider to be imaginative activity. And the question is, where does the tide stop? Does the tide keep rising to the point that AI is writing scripts for films that win Oscars or writing Booker Prize-winning novels? I can't see it myself, because I think the interesting thing about the imagination is there are several levels to it, and I go into this in the book. There's imagination which is just really connecting things, and then you have imaginative acts which somehow transcend the act of connection. They produce something entirely new. And then the other point is words and images are really a kind of conduit between the soul of the writer and the reader. And when there's no soul behind the words, what does that mean for the reader? Is it still possible to connect on the same level? And that for me is an interesting, and I think something like that. The Jaipur Literary Festival is an example of where we need to connect with the individuals who write the books. We need the human interface. And provenance, to use an artistic term, is such an interesting idea where we need to understand the humanity that goes into something. And if we don't have that, then it's missing something at a very primal level in our artistic experience.
And I feel like we underplay, but it really comes through in your book as well. Like the reader is that sort of missing link, the imagination of the reader, making that leap with the text they're interacting with, right? Which is, again, a very human experience.
Completely, yes. I mean, the greatest works of literature are ones where where the writer meets you halfway. There's a great quote by Lawrence Stern that I have in my book, where he regards writing as a conversation, and really the writer does half the work and the reader must do the other half of the work. And I think that's a very important dynamic to understand. If one's ever embarking on a piece of creative writing, one has to leave things for the reader to guess and leave things to be implied and to be not completely understood in order to make them human and real.
I have a couple more questions, but we definitely want to make this as interactive, make the leap and the connection as well. So if you have questions, we'll take a show of hands in a bit. You talk to us in this book about something called a commonplace book, and you've talked about how you've put this into practice. Might be fun to unpack that a bit. What is it?
Yes, well, the commonplace book it would have been a very familiar notion in the Enlightenment period. It's really a notebook that you keep for yourself, where you write down interesting things that you've read or heard or come across. And the cumulative effect of keeping these commonplace books over time allows you to make connections that you might not otherwise have made. And I keep actually several commonplace books, but I'll come back to me in a minute. If you look in history, probably the great keeper of commonplace books was Leonardo da Vinci, who has left us thousands and thousands of pages of his notes, which are fascinating in their variety and detail. So you'll have a scientific theorem next to a doodle of a shell, next to a riddle, next to a shopping list. And this goes on for thousands of pages, and then little lines like saying, "The sun does not move," which he'd written in backwards writing, so that he couldn't be read by other people. And really, it was a very radical notion at that point, so he was trying to hide it from the authorities. The point really about this is it allows you to make connections across disciplines. So he is the prime example of somebody who was a great artist and a great engineer and scientist, and somebody whose mind made connections where he would seamlessly see the curls of a woman's hair and the eddies of a river's flow being the same thing visually. And he'd paint the Mona Lisa by day, and by night he'd be cutting up corpses to look at exactly how the face was built. So he was somebody who really, it was the great genius of all time in terms of making connections and by keeping commonplace books. Yeah. I'm always struck by the comment made by Walter Isaacson, who was the biographer of Leonardo da Vinci and also the biographer of Steve Jobs. And he said it was much, much easier to write the biography of Leonardo da Vinci because there was so much more source material, because he'd left so many more papers than Steve Jobs. So this tradition really started, he was the great exponent of this tradition, and it's actually changed the way, having researched this book, it's changed the way that I read books. In the Renaissance, I mean, we're all used to reading books, I imagine you do too, in a more or less linear form. We read one book, we finish it, and then we read another book. In the Renaissance, they would read several books at the same time, and they would take notes, and they'd scribble, and they'd tear things out, and they'd copy out the interesting passages into their commonplace books. And over time, they build, like sort of sediment gradually accumulating, they build this great personal body of knowledge. And so you can look back 5 years ago at something you wrote and make a connection with something you've thought today. And I'm a big believer in this, and I try and do it in my own life, where I've got 4 or 5 books on the go at any one time, and I take notes from them. It requires a bit of discipline and a bit of energy, but the rewards over time are gripping. And I've got one from my 20s, and you see your own self evolving over time.
Your trajectory as well.
Yes, exactly.
Did you bring one to Jaipur?
I've got this one here, but
okay.
that's a special one.
So the next book we're going to see what you made of all of the festival stuff.
Exactly.
So there's this other really funny anecdote. So in this, again, it's a very erudite book, very accessible, so highly recommend. You talk about coffee culture, right? You talk about how coffee shops started. And there's this really funny bit where Albert writes about how, initially when they started, it was a place for people to trade news. People would walk in and be like, "What's up? What's the news?" And you tried to do this in a Starbucks recently. Do you want to take us through that?
Yes, it went very badly. I was, the coffee shop, I'm really talking about London, England, in the 17th century, where something revolutionary happened in 1653. A Turkish immigrant came to London and started a coffee stall in the back streets of the city. And the coffee had never been drunk in the country before. And within 10 years, there were 80 coffee shops, and within 20, 30 years, there were hundreds and then thousands of coffee shops. And this really changed the country, and to a great extent, changed the world. And what they allowed people to do was to meet and talk freely outside of the constraints of academia and the church. And so it brought all sorts of people together. And it started, magazines and newspapers started in the coffee shops, Lloyd's insurance started in the coffee shops, and the city trading started in the coffee shops. So all this really came out of these, and people like Newton and Hans Sloane and all these great thinkers came together to really hear what was going on in the world. And they would walk in to the coffee shop and say, "What's the news?" And then they would hear from the people in the coffee shop what was going on in the world, and somebody just come back from the, far-flung adventures and would tell the stories of traveling in Asia and Africa. So it was really the only way of getting information. And in the city, if you in the insurance world, this is a way of finding out that the ship you'd invested in had just sunk, and you got the information first, had you been in the Lloyd's coffee shop. Anyway, I'm fascinated by the evolution of the coffee shop, which, as we know, has become an enormous phenomenon around the world. And I tried in a Starbucks in London to go, and I went in and said, "What's the news?" And to the people in the coffee shop, to which they all looked up as if I was some kind of weirdo, which perhaps I was, and then went back to their Apple laptops, into their AirPods, into their own confined world. So I miss something about that world, something about random encounters. And I think the imagination misses it. I think our minds miss this idea of groups, of clusters. I mean, here we are in a cluster now, but really the great steps forward in history have often been around clusters. So the coffee shops were clusters, the salons of the Enlightenment were clusters, the homebrew computer club where Steve Jobs met Steve Wozniak was a cluster, Darwin and Shakespeare and Virginia Woolf, they all had their own clusters of sorts. So this convening of minds, which I don't think is quite the same in a digital environment, although that does bring interesting benefits. It's such an important part of how we think and how we have ideas.
Yeah, convening a Slack chat room doesn't have the same vibe somehow.
It doesn't. It has its virtues.
It has its... but, I guess in India we do have... I don't know how many people have been to a chai wala recently, and you'll see this, of course, at the Lit Fest, but when, we do congregate around the tea wala, where people will go and get the gossip. I'm not sure.
I suspect you're better at it here than we are in the UK.
Yeah. So some things haven't changed that much yet.
No, good.
I'd love to see a show of hands if people have questions. Yes, perfect. Okay, brilliant. Can we get mics out? B is in the front. There's someone in the back. So 2 questions this side. Okay, excellent. 3 questions that side. It's going to become like a competitive race at this point. Let's get we'll get some mics out.
Hi, you talk about commonplace books, putting in your most intimate thoughts. I have to imagine that there are intimacies and moments that are deeply personal to you. How do you feel about writing something down that might come across that perhaps you wouldn't want somebody else to see? I ask because sometimes you put in a trust in your commonplace book that, sorry, I'm a little nervous, I'm so excited.
That's all right, take your time.
That there's a potential fear that someone's almost reading your diary. How do you move past that?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. I think there are different types of commonplace books, and I think what you're describing drifts or blends into what is more like a diary, more like an emotional notebook. I think the commonplace book that I think of is one more of ideas, but I think you can do anything. I think the point is to have something that you respond to, that something that makes you, that engages you. And also, I think the other point of it is something that pushes you in new directions. So it encourages you to read things you wouldn't normally read. And really, it's the point of the commonplace book, as opposed to the diary or something where you're unburdening yourself of emotional issues, is really in the variety of sources that come into it. So it's a bit different to what you're describing. But I think what you're describing is equally, if not more important. And I think that's really down to the individual to decide how they want to use it. But I think the point is to use it in a way that serves you personally well.
And analog, not online. It's interesting that it's...
Yes, I hesitate to say this in a Samsung-sponsored event. And I think I got a tablet, and I might buy a Samsung one now, come to think of it. But I think the joy of pen and paper is not to be underestimated. I think really the ability to to find things easily, the physicality of the commonplace book being there in front of you on the shelf, reminding you of its existence, rather than being stored in some cloud-based file that you've forgotten about. I think that for me is personally, and even the act of writing, the pen and paper, ideas come in the process of writing.
In a different way when you write longhand. That's true. That was a great question. We have two in the front, so maybe you can go and then hand over the mic.
Excuse me, sir. I want to ask if there is a person who used imaginations in the book, and after sometimes he lacks its visualization if he reads the book, and he has a great connection. So how can he improve his imagination then?
And can you pass
I
the mic?
didn't quite understand the question. Did you get it?
How do you improve the imagination if there's not enough visualization? Is that what you...
If there is no more visualization, if a person is not having that much visualization, but but he used to read a book, and so how can he improve his imagination?
How can he improve his own imagination if he's not able to visualize beyond a point?
Read the book.
No, sir.
Read his, yeah. Thank you.
I wonder if my question might be connected to yours. I wanted to ask you to reflect on the role of daydreaming and boredom.
Yes, I think they're both very important. And I think, as the piece that I read earlier on, I think the real problem in life today is we've forgotten how to be bored. And when we stand in a queue, we get out our phones and we check our emails. And I think this is a real problem, and I see it in my children. And I think what I call the spaces in between, these moments of reflection that happen in the natural rhythm of life, are being smoothed out by technology. And I think that's a problem. I always refer to two people who had their breakthrough ideas while sitting on a bus. One was Henri Poincaré, the 19th century mathematician, who had this enormous breakthrough in very complicated fusion models to do with non-Euclidean geometry while getting on a bus in Normandy. He just came to him while he was just standing there with a ticket. And the other person was George Michael, composed Careless Whispers saxophone solo while getting on a bus in North London. So these moments, they come to you in random times, and you've really got to cultivate these moments of unconscious bubbling up of thoughts that have accumulated without needing the moment to find their release.
Thank you. That's fascinating. And in the book, I do have to point out, you do say that we need to cultivate these spaces. Like that's something that we're all forgetting how to do.
We're forgetting how to do it. That for me is a concern.
Okay, there's some questions on this side. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, hi. I'm a runaway doctor into designing by passion now. So I was wondering, with so much global exposure to ideas on the digital world, is it possible to be original nowadays?
Well, it's a very good question. I think the answer is yes, but I think I would ask us to penetrate the notion of originality and what it means to be original, because I think we place too much weight on originality. I think the idea of originality came from the romantic, at least in the Western world, the romantic poets felt they discovered originality, and there's always been something that's been treasured as being vital and important. But I suppose the point I'd make about originality is often things aren't that original when you scrutinize them. When you think of an artist like Picasso and his breakthrough work of art, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, what he was doing really was combining sources in a way that nobody else had done before. He was combining Cézanne and African art and Iberian sculpture and bringing things together in a wholly new and unexpected way. And that is originality. But really, the people who are original, in my view, are people who have cultivated their own, what I call the imaginative palette, where you're going back to reading what no one else is reading and having this variety of sources which allows you to have original thoughts. Really, originality is about unexpected collisions that you've made that nobody else has made. So I absolutely think originality with that definition in mind, is still very much possible and necessary.
You talk about how he's actually, with the Picasso example, that he was walking around a market and saw these African masks discarded in a museum, and then no one else had actually made that connection.
Correct.
So that
yes, and that led to Cubism and the whole world of modern art and the modern world, in fact.
Yeah. Great question. Thank you. Okay, we're trying to get mics to. Do you want to stand up? Who has a question? Lady in the white. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, I was trying to coordinate that while you asked.
That's fine.
Hi, my name is Aditi. Thank you so much for this conversation. So, on the point of spontaneity, do you believe in the practicing of rituals to build that imagination muscle?
I do. I think everybody has their own rituals, but I think the point is to find the ones that work for you. In my research, one of the things that I've always half noticed about my own rituals was something that I then discovered other people did in history, which was as an example of a ritual, if this is what you mean by ritual, is when I'm not rushing off somewhere in the morning, I will go straight to my desk in the morning, and I find the first hour or two of the morning, if you can find the time, at the weekends or whenever it may be, is the most precious moment for the imagination. But as soon as you've checked your emails or looked at the news, it's over. So for me, that for me is a ritual, and that's something that is true. And again, it comes back to this connection with the unconscious, where you're still half asleep, you're half awake, and your mind is able to roam backwards and forwards between the sort of wild chaos of your dreams into the ordered rationality of your day life, of your to-do list day. And it's really this fertile territory in between them that for me is so magical, if you can grasp it. And I think really it's for you to find the rituals that help you do that. And it's for me it's a waking moment. For others, and for me it's walking. I mean, that's a very familiar one. Being in the shower is another very familiar one. Everyone has their moments. The key is to find them.
And to be open to them, right?
And to be open to them. And to be conscious of them, exactly. To be aware that your mind is having ideas. Often we have ideas without really thinking about, oh, this is interesting. This is the moment that I'm having ideas, if you see what I mean.
And it's actually interesting because you've been juggling so many identities, like this insane day job. So finding that time for yourself, creating that space just for yourself to have
I find it enormously restorative and important for my own well-being that I do spend some time imagining in some form.
And hopefully most of you will have got taken that away from this conversation. We can take a couple more questions. Yes, who's getting the mic?
10 minutes.
Yes, thank you.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
I have talked about the importance of random human interactions and conversations at places or cafes, but then the confined personal zones of digital age. Is it the time to reconsider about humanity?
Reconsider humanity?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
You're talking about like the importance of random connections at cafes and so on, but we're all moving to these kind of digital isolated spaces.
Yes, I think we've got to try and find ways of recreating those spaces or compensating for the digital side of our lives, which, by the way, does have enormous benefits. It brings people together across countries and cultures and age groups. So I think there is a value to the digital world, but it's got to be carefully managed, and it's got to be blended with the physical interactions that we've had in the past.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I think one of my takeaways from this book is like just having that space for the spontaneous. With digital, what ends up happening is obviously the much talked about echo chambers. Like go and find people, read, things people are not reading, find people that you might not, come across. That's one way of bridging that divide.
Yes, and the thing that is particularly, I think, an issue in the UK and Europe is perfecting the art of disagreement and allowing people to have ideas without closing people down in discussion. I think that's a real issue at the moment in where I come from.
Here too. The less said, the better. Okay, yes. Can we get a mic on this side as well? Yeah, you got one. Great.
So my question was basically about like this almost purist idea of the integrity of art that some poets hold. So, like Charles Bukowski's poem comes to mind. I don't remember it word to word, of course, but he says something about how if your writing doesn't tear out of your gut or like pour out of your soul, then don't write at all. Now, we've obviously discussed about how like not focusing on the product of art, but then creating helps our imagination. But what's your take on like this idea of damaging the integrity of art by potentially doing that? Is that just people being pretentious? Yes. Or is there like a line that I have to draw of, oh, poetry I might be good at, but then watercolors I'm terrible at, so I probably shouldn't do that.
I don't think you should think you're terrible at anything. I think the point is doing it and trying it and detaching the notion of success, particularly success in the eyes of other people. I think the joy of expressing yourself in whatever way you choose to express yourself artistically, creatively, through words or images or music, the joy is in doing it, and everything else is irrelevant.
I love that question. Young people, we're going to be working for you very soon. I love it. Yeah. Next.
Hi. So this question is about, imagination and thoughts. I think everybody has them. Everybody, not just writers or people who are planning to write. So as a housewife, as a person, like I often find a lot of my ideas come when I'm, stirring the pot or doing some mundane exercise, but my mind is working separately. Yeah. But the speed of thought is much faster, that if I want to capture that and if I want to write it down, first of all, my chores and other things, prevent me. And by that time, the idea is lost.
Yes.
And then when I want to put it down, somehow the nature of those thoughts change the moment you get a pen and a paper, and that is scary, kind of, so then you wonder how easily I was able to flit from one idea to the next, and I had this whole thing figured out while I was stirring the pot, but I'm not able to put it down on paper.
I know.
What do you suggest?
It's a story of my life. I mean, all I can suggest is you turn the flame off. and you go and write it down as soon as you can. Because I think, I remember Roald Dahl saying you have to write things in the fog of the windscreen, because once you've forgotten them, they're gone forever. And I think that is a very important point. And I think if you can, you've got to stop everything and write it down. I often send myself emails or write little notes, and then I write them on paper later. So you've got to find devices that capture things in the moment.
You could record the voice notes, so you don't burn your house down.
You see, the thing is that it's also a privilege to be able to record. You have so many other things to do.
Yeah.
I know.
So, and ideas, like also about the coffee places where you exchange ideas. It happens in rural India, in chai shops, like you mentioned, or in barber shops also.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
But that is also a very male-dominated area. I'm not saying that women they have their own groups where they get together as women. But to get news of the world beyond their world, that is quite gender sort of specific.
Well, the coffee shops of the 18th century, I'm afraid, were only for men.
Yeah.
And
So how do we make it egalitarian?
We open our own. There's a whole startup dedicated to this, which I will talk to you about after the session. But thank you. That's a great question. And I think so. It's not that you don't use tech. Like she could record a voice note.
Yes,
get
I
the
think
idea down.
use tech. I'm a big believer in tech for enabling the recording of thoughts, but then I go back to paper later. And
I think the idea being, prioritize that idea, the creativity as well. We have 5 more minutes, so we'll pass the mic.
Sure,
on.
sure. Thank you so much.
Brilliant question.
Very
Maybe
good
one
question.
or two questions more, if we go quickly.
If imagination...
Sorry, where are we?
Yeah.
Oh, right in the front.
If imagination is getting new ideas which have not been thought before, do you find that with the modern media culture, when people are threatened by ideas, which, let's face it, in a way, that's what they are, they're threatening.
Yes.
Do you find that people are much quicker to dox you, to chase after you with modern media, and is this an impediment? Someone starting something completely new, it threatens an accepted thought.
I think there's a whole huge problem in society, in that you can have I'm a big believer in bad ideas that are on their way to being a good idea. So I think a lot of things get closed down because they become so public so quickly, and so I think it is a problem, because I think I see this in the office environment, and when I was running the Condé Nast business, I was always trying to create an environment where people could feel they could have bad ideas, because a bad idea around a table, you don't know where it's going to take you. And I think that the difficulty in a life where we're all on digital platforms, detached from each other, it's very easy to criticize, and it's very easy to judge, and it's very easy to knock things down. And the problem with that is you're killing something tender, which could evolve into something magical, but it never got the chance to do that. And that is what we have to try and fix in our society.
And that's interesting. You talk about the office environment and making sure it's like a safe space for bad ideas. People shouldn't feel shamed for, which tends to happen. This fear of humiliation or.
Definitely. Yes, and I think particularly if you're young and just starting out, and often those are the best ideas. or they're half an idea. They're something which they don't quite understand. But often it's, going back to the beginner's mindset. Often somebody coming into a company sees things fresh, and they see things in a way that those who've been there for a long time are too encumbered by the history and their experience to see things anew.
Okay, last question.
Hello, sir. Hello, ma'am. So my question is,
Do you want to come in front so you can see?
Yeah, no problem. I'll come there. So my question to you is, when someone really has an artistic mind, do you become prone to having those serendipitous accidents happening to you? Because you quoted Alexander Fleming discovering that antibiotic, but to the best of my knowledge, it happened more out of an accident versus something that came off his imagination.
Well, it came out of his ability to notice things, I think, and I think that's connected to the imagination. So a lot of what I write about in the book is to do with observation, is to do with seeing things that other people glance over, seeing things that other people miss. So he saw something that other people would have missed, and I think that is connected to his artistic. I mean, I'm slightly speculating here, but in my view, the artistic mind, which always notices things, notices the detail, sees things that other people don't see. That, if you take that back into being a scientist, and you say, you ask questions. The curious mind is the curiosity muscle. Perhaps the next book is strengthened, and so the artistic curiosity comes back to the scientific curiosity. Is how I would put it.
I got my answer. Thank you so much.
Great question. So, we have
question.
just a minute and change left. Albert, anything you want people to take away from, as we go off into the world?
Well, I think all I would take away, all I could take away, all I can ask you to take away is this idea of being imaginative for yourself, not being the passive recipient of other people's imaginations. And there's I said this before, but I take this, Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of Franklin D. Roosevelt, had this line she said, do something, can I read this bit? She said, do something every day that scares you. She says, do one thing every day that scares you. These small things that make us uncomfortable help us build the courage to do the work we do. Now, I would say, I've written a variation on that. I say, do one imaginative thing every day that scares you, perhaps every week. Scribble a short story, a drawing, an observation, an idea to change something around you. These small imaginative acts will make you uncomfortable, and when you venture to retrieve the piece of paper the following morning, they will look ridiculous in the cold light of day. You might laugh at yourself and feel some misguided flush of shame, but eventually you will lose your fear, your self-mockery, your embarrassment. You will begin to feel comfortable with imaginative risk, because there's no real risk at all. They're just ideas. And you start to wonder, what was I afraid of? You begin to feel stronger, and you realize by risking yourself imaginatively, you'll gradually build your courage to do the important imaginative work that we all need to do.
Brilliant.
Thank you.